Hey, a woman on the Appalachian Trail once followed her own name being called uphill, off-trail, into fog, and found her own bootprint already waiting in the mud ahead of her. She was hiking alone. No one else had signed the shelter register in 9 days, and a hard freeze had locked the ground solid an hour before. Nothing should have left a fresh print in frozen mud. She made it off the mountain before dark. She has never gone back to that stretch of trail since, and she still won't say why out loud. To understand it, you have to go back to the morning she signed her name in that register, thinking it was just another cold, quiet day on the trail. Her name was Dana, and she'd started the section 3 days earlier with a full pack. A paper map folded soft from handling, and the kind of silence in her chest that only comes after a marriage ends quietly instead of loudly. She wasn't running from anything specific. She just wanted miles where nobody needed anything from her. 34 years old, 7 years of backpacking behind her. Not an expert, but not careless either. She'd done cold weather trips before. She knew how to read a sky. That morning, she'd woken at a 3-sided shelter tucked into a gap between 2 ridgelines, the kind of place thru-hikers pass through and forget the name of within a week. The shelter register sat on a shelf someone had nailed into the wall years ago, its cover swollen from 100 wet seasons, spine cracked down the middle. She flipped through it while her coffee cooled, the way hikers do, reading strangers' handwriting for company. Trail names, dates, a few jokes about blisters. Nothing that stood out. She signed her own name, wrote the date, and under notes put solo, heading north, planning to push to the next shelter before the cold front hits. No one had signed in the 9 days before her. The last entry read like it had been written in a hurry, the letters slanting hard to the right. She filtered water at a spring below the shelter, crouching on a flat rock with her hands going numb around the pump, and retaped a blister on her left heel that had been bothering her since yesterday's descent. Her phone showed no bars, hadn't for 2 days, so she checked her paper map instead, tracing the day's route with a cold finger. 6 miles up and over a ridge, then down into the next gap where the following shelter waited. Simple enough on a normal day. She ate a tortilla wrap standing up, cold and a little stiff from the night's temperature, and packed out before 8. The morning held that particular kind of Appalachian quiet that isn't silence so much as absence. No birds working the treetops yet, no wind moving the bare rhododendron leaves, just her own breathing and the crunch of frozen leaf litter under her boots. The cold front the forecast had warned about hadn't arrived yet, but the ground told her it was close. A hard freeze had come through overnight, locking the mud on the trail into something closer to concrete, each print from days-old traffic frozen into permanent little sculptures along the tread. She started up a long switchback around mile 4, gaining elevation steadily, breath fogging in front of her. That was when she heard it. Her name. Called once, from somewhere above the trail, off to her left, up through a stand of bare hardwoods where the ridge climbed away from the switchback. She stopped walking. It wasn't loud, it wasn't close, but it had the shape of a real voice, not wind moving through branches, not some trick of acoustics she could easily explain away. It sounded like someone who might have left the shelter after she did. Someone catching up, calling ahead the way hikers sometimes do to announce themselves on a blind switchback. "Hello?" she called back, turning to face uphill, scanning the gray trunks for movement. Nothing answered. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, listening to nothing, and told herself the obvious thing, that it had been some hiker who'd signed in after her, or a hunter working the ridge, or her own mind doing what minds do in that kind of quiet, filling silence with something familiar. The wind picked up faintly a second later, moving through the bare canopy with a low, uneven sound, and she decided that was probably all it had been. Wind through hardwoods can sound like almost anything if you're alone long enough to want it to. She kept walking. The switchback leveled out onto a short, flat stretch before climbing again, and it was there, maybe 200 yards past where she'd heard the voice, that she saw the print. One boot print, pressed into the frozen mud dead center of the trail, pointed the same direction she was walking. She almost didn't register it as strange at first. The trail was covered in old prints, dozens of them locked into the frozen ground from hikers who'd passed through before the freeze set in. But this one was different. The edges were sharp, clean, not softened by frost the way every other print around it was. And the tread pattern, when she crouched to look closer, matched her own boots almost exactly. Same brand, same wear pattern on the left heel where she always struck first. She told herself it was a coincidence. Popular boot brand, popular trail, hundreds of hikers wearing the same tread pattern every season. That part made sense. What didn't make sense, and what she didn't let herself think about until much later that night, was the frost. Every other print on that stretch of trail had a thin skin of frost inside it, the same frost coating everything else the freeze had touched. This one didn't. The mud inside it was still faintly damp, still holding shape the way only fresh mud does, hours after the ground around it had locked solid. She stood over it for a long moment, pack straps digging into her shoulders, breath slowing back to normal. Then she kept walking, because that's what you do. You keep walking, and you let the day's ordinary tasks smooth the strange thing over. The elevation gain, the next water source, the ache starting in her left knee, the 6 miles still ahead of her before the shelter and the fire she was already looking forward to. By early afternoon, she'd mostly convinced herself the print had some boring explanation she just hadn't thought of yet. A trick of light. An old print she'd misjudged. Something. She didn't think about the voice again until much later that evening, when she was alone in a different shelter, and it called her name a second time. She reached the second shelter a little before 5, with maybe 40 minutes of usable light left, and a cold settling into her hands that no amount of walking seemed to shake. It was a smaller structure than the last one, tucked back off the trail behind a stand of hemlocks, 3 walls and a tin roof, and a stacked stone fire ring out front that someone had used recently enough that the ash still smelled faintly of pine smoke. She dropped her pack on the wooden sleeping platform, unlaced her boots, and got a small fire going before the last of the light went, because a fire is the kind of thing that makes an empty shelter feel less empty. She was alone. The register on the shelf confirmed it. Nobody had signed in for 2 days, and the last entry before that was just a name and a date, nothing else. She almost didn't bother reading further back, but something made her flip a page or two, the way you do when you're bored and cold and waiting for water to boil, and 2 entries above her own she found a line that made her stop. Don't answer if it calls your name after dark. Signed, a friend. No date attached to the note itself, just tucked in under someone else's entry like an afterthought. She read it twice, the kind of thing that would have made her laugh out loud on any other night. Trail registers were full of jokes like that. Half the entries in any shelter book were somebody trying to be funny for the next hiker who'd read it. She closed the register, propped it back on its shelf, and told herself that's exactly what it was. A joke. Hikers had a strange sense of humor about the woods sometimes, especially the ones who'd been out there long enough to get a little strange themselves. She ate dinner, sitting cross-legged near the fire, a dehydrated meal rehydrated with water she'd filtered that morning, and let herself enjoy 20 minutes of feeling normal. The temperature had dropped hard with the sunset, the cold front finally arriving the way the forecast had promised, and she could see her breath even sitting close to the flames. She banked the fire before crawling into her sleeping bag on the platform, boots lined up neatly against the shelter wall, headlamp within reach, the way she always set up camp whether or not she expected to need anything in a hurry. It was somewhere past 10 when she heard her name again. Not from outside this time. From the back corner of the shelter, close to where her pack leaned against the wall. She went rigid inside the sleeping bag, every part of her suddenly awake in that specific way that happens when your body understands something before your mind catches up. She didn't move. She listened to her own heartbeat for a long moment before she let herself believe she'd actually heard it, and not just half-dreamed it in the gap between waking and sleep. Then it came again. Her name, the same word, but wrong somehow. The emphasis landing on the wrong syllable. The way a stranger might read a name off a page instead of speaking one they'd learned by ear. The way it might sound if whoever or whatever had said it had only ever seen it written down. In a register. Signed in her own handwriting, 2 shelters back. She didn't answer. She thought about the line in the register, the joke that didn't feel like a joke anymore, and she kept her mouth shut and her eyes open in the dark, staring at the shelter's low tin roof, listening to nothing but the fire's last embers ticking as they cooled. The voice didn't come a third time, but she didn't sleep, not really, not in any way that counted. She lay there, running through everything rational her mind could offer her. An owl. Some hikers know how owls can carry strange sounds that trick the ear into hearing words. Another camper somewhere nearby, playing a bad joke. Her own exhausted brain doing what exhausted brains do in silence this complete. None of it fit cleanly. All of it fit well enough to almost let her close her eyes again. She thought about leaving right then, packing up by headlamp and hiking out in the dark. But the next shelter was 6 miles off, over a ridge she didn't know well, in temperatures now dropping well below freezing. On a trail she'd need both hands and full attention to navigate safely. Leaving in the dark felt like the more dangerous choice, not the safer one. So she stayed because staying was the sensible thing to do, and she told herself that over and over until the sky finally started to gray at the edges of the tree line. She was up before full light, moving fast, the kind of fast that isn't quite panic but isn't calm either. She wanted coffee, wanted her boots on, wanted to be walking before she had to think too hard about the night before. She stepped outside the shelter to fill her water bottle at a nearby spring and stopped cold in the frost-covered clearing. A ring of prints circled the shelter. Not hers, she checked, comparing them against her own boot beside them, and the tread didn't match anything she owned or had seen on the trail. They weren't sharp-edged and deliberate like footsteps someone takes walking a straight line. They were closer together, evenly spaced, circling the entire structure in a loop that started and ended nowhere she could identify, like something had walked slow, steady laps around the shelter through the coldest hours of the night. They stopped at the edge of the fire ring. Every single lap, all the way around the shelter, and not one print crossed inside that stone boundary. She stood there a long moment in the gray early light, breath fogging, feeling the cold settle somewhere deeper than her hands now. She thought about the register entry again. Don't answer if it calls your name after dark. She thought about the frost coating every other surface in that clearing except, she noticed now, the ground directly inside that ring of prints, which held a strange, faint dampness the frost hadn't quite managed to claim. She didn't wait for coffee. She packed her bag in 11 minutes, laced her boots with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking from the cold, or from something else. and she was on the trail before the sun cleared the ridge. She never signed another shelter register on that section of trail again. Even now, when people ask her about that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, she changes the subject, or says something vague about the weather, or the mileage, or how pretty the overlooks are in October. She doesn't mention the register entry, or the voice that got her name almost right, or the ring of prints that circled her shelter and stopped clean at the fire. She got off the mountain by mid-afternoon. She has never gone back. The next account comes from a man who worked that same section of forest for a very different reason. Not hiking it, but maintaining it alone, with a chainsaw and a truck and a fire road most hikers never even know exists. His name doesn't matter much to the story. Most people in town just call him by his trail crew nickname, and that's how the hostel owner who eventually told this account referred to him too. What matters is that he'd been clearing storm damage off a stretch of Forest Service road for going on 15 years, ever since a summer job turned into steady seasonal work, and in all that time he'd never once had a reason to think twice about being out there alone. The storm had come through 3 days earlier, a fast-moving system that dropped enough wind to snap hardwood limbs like matchsticks across half the ridge, and the fire road crossing the Appalachian Trail near mile marker 11 had taken the worst of it. Blowdown everywhere. Branches thick as a man's leg scattered across the gravel. One full oak laid down across the road itself. Roots torn up and exposed like something had reached down and pulled the whole tree sideways out of the ground. He'd started early, hauling his gear out to the site in a truck that had seen better decades, chainsaw and gas cans and flagging tape rattling in the bed. The fire road wasn't much. A single-lane gravel track the Forest Service used maybe twice a year, mostly grown in at the edges, cutting through dense timber before it crossed the AT and continued on toward a locked gate a few miles further. Most thru-hikers passing that section never even noticed it existed. It was his kind of place. Quiet, unbothered. He mixed his oil ratio at the tailgate, checked the saw's chain tension, and got to work on the downed oak first, the big, satisfying cuts that clear a road fast. By mid-morning, he'd made good progress. 3 cars worth of trunk sectioned and rolled off to the shoulder, sawdust settling into the wet bark smell that always hung around a fresh cut. He radioed a check-in to dispatch around 11, more out of habit than necessity. The dispatcher on duty that day was a woman named Carol, who mostly just grunted acknowledgement before going quiet again on her end. He worked through lunch, eating a gas station sandwich on the tailgate with sawdust still on his hands, flagging the worst of the blowdown with orange tape so the next crew through would know where he'd stopped. It was routine work. He'd done 100 days just like it. Sometime after 2, walking back down the road to grab a fresh gas can from the truck, he noticed tire tracks in the soft shoulder mud that hadn't been there that morning. He stood over them a moment, running the day back through his head. He'd parked in the same spot since sunup. He hadn't heard another vehicle, not that he necessarily would have, over the saw running most of the morning. But the tracks bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name at first. They came from the direction of the locked gate further up the road, cut a wide arc through the mud like a vehicle turning around, and then headed back the same way they'd come. No tracks leading past his truck. No sign of anyone having gotten out to look at his work, or wave, or ask what he was doing out there. He figured it for another maintenance crew, or maybe a hunter who'd gotten past the gate somehow, and thought better of whatever he'd planned. It happened sometimes. He went back to work and didn't think much more about it. Not until he walked back to the truck around 3:30 to grab his water jug and found his spare gas can sitting dead center in the middle of the road, 40 feet from where he'd left it that morning. Still capped. Upright. Sitting there like someone had set it down carefully instead of dropping it or kicking it. He stood looking at it for a long moment, saw still idling in his other hand, and did the thing anybody does first. He looked for footprints. There weren't any. Not around the can, not leading to it, not leading away from it. Just the can itself, sitting in the middle of a gravel road that had been empty an hour before, 40 feet from the tailgate where he'd set it down that morning and hadn't touched since. He picked it up, checked the cap, checked the level, full, untouched, nothing missing or added. He carried it back to the truck and set it exactly where it had been, and for the rest of the afternoon he found himself glancing up from the saw more often than usual, scanning the tree line without really meaning to. Nothing else happened. No more tracks. No more sounds beyond the ordinary. Birds working the canopy. A woodpecker somewhere off to the west. The saw's own engine drowning most of it out anyway. By the time he'd cleared the last of the major blowdown, the light was starting to slant low and orange through the trees. That particular late afternoon color that meant he had maybe an hour before he needed to be packing up. He radioed dispatch again around 4:30, mostly to report the road clear, and found himself adding, almost as a joke, that somebody'd moved his gas can on him out here. Some kind of prank, maybe. He laughed a little into the radio, waiting for Carol to laugh back, the way she usually did at his dry commentary. She didn't. There was a pause on the line, longer than radio dead air usually ran, before she came back with a flat, "Copy that," and nothing else. No joke back. No "watch your step" or "somebody's messing with you." The kind of easy back and forth they usually had after 15 years of the same routine check-ins. Just silence, and then her voice again, asking if he needed anything else before end of shift. He said no. He hung the radio back on his belt and stood there a second in the gravel road. The saw finally quiet, sawdust drifting slow in the last of the light, and told himself Carol was probably just tired or busy, or didn't feel like joking around that particular afternoon. People had off days. It didn't mean anything. He packed up his gear, loaded the truck, and told himself the same thing on the drive out that he'd tell himself a dozen more times before that evening was over. That there was probably somebody else with legitimate business out on that fire road that day, somebody he just hadn't crossed paths with. And the gas can thing was some kind of mix-up he wasn't seeing clearly. He didn't know yet that the drive out was going to be worse than anything that had happened all afternoon. The light was mostly gone by the time he finished loading the last of his gear, that deep blue hour where the forest stops looking like individual trees and starts looking like one solid wall pressing in from both sides of the road. He climbed into the truck, ran the heater for a minute against the evening chill, and started the slow drive out toward the gate. Headlights cutting twin cones through gathering fog that always seemed to pool up in these low stretches once the sun dropped. He was maybe half a mile in, taking the road slow because of the fresh-cut wood scattered along the shoulders, when his headlights swept across a figure standing at the edge of the gravel ahead. He hit the brakes without thinking about it. Gravel crunching under the tires, heart going hard in his chest before his mind even caught up to what he was reacting to. A man, standing just off the road's edge, facing the truck. Not moving, not raising a hand or stepping back or doing any of the things a person standing on a dark forest road usually does when headlights find them. By the time the truck came to a full stop, the figure was gone. He sat there a moment, engine idling, both hands still gripping the wheel, scanning the tree line where the man had been. Nothing. Just trunks and shadow and the fog drifting low across the road in thin gray sheets. He told himself it was a deer, or a trick of the headlights catching an odd angle of trunk and shadow that his tired brain had turned into a human shape. 15 years on this road, he'd seen plenty of things that looked like people in bad light and turned out to be nothing at all. He eased the truck forward again, slower now, eyes moving constantly between the road ahead and the tree lines on either side. He checked his mirror out of habit more than anything. The figure was standing in the road behind him. Same stance, same stillness. Facing the truck, growing smaller in the mirror as he kept moving forward, in a spot that should have been empty road, should have been nothing but the gravel and fog he'd just driven through seconds earlier. There was no way anyone could have crossed from where he'd first seen them to that spot behind the truck without being visible the entire time, not on a straight stretch of one-lane road with nowhere to hide. He didn't stop again. He kept driving, faster than he probably should have on wet gravel, watching the mirror more than the windshield, until the fog finally swallowed whatever had been standing back there. His radio crackled to life a moment later, and it was Carol's voice again, tighter now than the flat tone from earlier that afternoon. "You still on that fire road?" He told her yes, told her he was maybe 2 miles from the gate, and asked, trying to keep his voice level, if there was supposed to be anybody else out there that evening. Another crew, a hunter with permission, anybody at all. There was a pause before she answered. "Don't stop on that stretch after dark," she said, "and don't flash your brights at anything standing in the road. Just keep driving." He asked her what she meant by that. Asked her straight out if she'd seen something out there before, on this same road, and she didn't really answer. She just repeated the second half of what she'd already said. Keep driving, get to the gate, radio in once he was clear. And then the line went quiet in a way that told him she wasn't going to say anything else about it. Not over the radio, maybe not ever. The road narrowed further as it climbed the last rise before the gate, 1 lane wide with no shoulder to speak of. A drop-off into a ravine dropping steep to his right, where a bad turn or a moment's distraction would put the truck somewhere he had no interest in ending up. There was no room to reverse, no safe place to turn around even if he'd wanted to. The only way out was forward, through whatever was or wasn't standing along the next half-mile of road. He didn't see the figure again. He kept his eyes moving, kept both hands tight on the wheel, and didn't touch the radio dial he usually kept low on a country station, because right then the silence felt safer than anything that might fill it. When he finally reached the gate, he threw the truck into park harder than he needed to, and sat there a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, before he made himself get out to lock up behind him the way he did every evening. His hands were steadier than he expected. That surprised him a little, distantly, the way small details do when your mind is mostly occupied with something else. He walked around to the tailgate to grab the padlock chain and stopped. The gas can, the one from that morning, the one that had been moved 40 feet up the road and then set back exactly where it belonged, was sitting on the tailgate itself. Not in the truck bed where he'd loaded it an hour earlier. On top of the tailgate, centered, upright, as if someone had set it there deliberately while he was locking the gate. He hadn't touched it since loading up. He was certain of that. He picked it up with hands that had gone cold despite the mild evening, and that was when he saw it. A single handprint pressed into the dust coating the tailgate's metal surface, right where the can had been sitting. Adult-sized. Fingers spread wide, palm flat, pressed down hard enough to leave a clear print in the film of road dust that had built up over the day's driving. He crouched and checked the ground around the truck. Nothing. No footprints leading to the tailgate, none leading away. Nothing in the soft shoulder dirt that should have shown any sign of somebody walking up to touch his truck while he was 30 feet away, locking a gate. He didn't linger. He got in, locked the doors out of a habit he'd never had reason to use on that road before, and drove the rest of the way to the highway without touching the radio once. The Forest Service reclassified that stretch of fire road not long after, changing it to request only access, though nobody ever gave him a clear reason why. He still maintains that section when the work calls for it. He just doesn't do it after 3 in the afternoon anymore, no matter how much daylight the season gives him. And if you ask him why, he'll usually just say the light's better in the mornings anyway, and leave it at that. The next account doesn't come from someone who worked the woods for a living. It comes from a man who went looking for someone else entirely, following a sound that shouldn't have been where it was. He'd been doing search and rescue on that section of trail for 11 years by the time this happened, long enough to know the terrain better than most rangers, long enough that very little about the woods still surprised him. His name was Rob, though the account mostly circulates without it, and he'd been part of dozens of searches over the years. Lost hikers, overdue hunters, one bad winter where they'd pulled 3 people off the mountain in a single week. He wasn't the kind of man who spooked easily. That's part of why this story carries the weight it does among the people who know him. The missing hiker was a 26-year-old man who'd gone off trail near a section of canyon the locals had a bad habit of avoiding, though nobody official ever explained exactly why, beyond the terrain being difficult and the drop-offs being real. He'd been overdue 30 hours by the time Rob's team got the call, his last known GPS ping showing him near the canyon rim before the signal cut out entirely. They'd searched hard through the first day, grid by grid, radios crackling with negative reports from every team as the light started fading. Rob knew that canyon about as well as anyone, knew where the walls narrowed enough to kill radio signal, knew which sections held water and which stayed dry even after heavy rain, knew the particular way sound bounced and distorted off rock in certain spots. His team had cleared the canyon floor by early afternoon on the first day, marked it off the active grid, and moved their search further north toward a ridge where a partial bootprint had turned up. It was the second night, close to 11, when he heard the whistle. 3 short blasts. The standard distress signal every hiker who'd ever taken a wilderness safety course knew by heart, drilled into them precisely because it cuts through wind and distance better than a shout. It came from the direction of the canyon, the same canyon his team had already grid searched and cleared that morning. He stopped where he stood, headlamp beam cutting a narrow cone through ground fog that had settled into the lower elevations after sunset, and listened hard. Nothing for a moment. Then it came again. 3 short blasts, same interval, same rhythm, precise enough that it could have been a recording. He radioed it in immediately, standard protocol, giving his position and asking if any other team was operating near the canyon. The response came back negative across the board. No team assigned to that grid tonight. No team within 2 miles of his position. He stood there in the fog a moment longer, coffee gone cold in the thermos clipped to his pack, running through the obvious explanations the way 11 years of training had taught him to. Canyon acoustics could do strange things, sound traveling further than it should, echoing off walls in ways that made distance and direction hard to judge accurately. It was possible the whistle was coming from somewhere else entirely, carried and distorted by the terrain until it only sounded like it originated in the canyon. But real distress whistling doesn't usually repeat with that kind of precision. He'd heard enough of it over the years. Panicked, uneven blasts, sometimes trailing off as exhaustion or hypothermia set in, rarely, if ever, maintaining a clean, steady 3 count like a metronome. This had the rhythm of something that wasn't tired, wasn't panicking, wasn't running out of breath the way a person lost for 30 hours and dropping temperatures generally would be. He logged it anyway, because that's what protocol required. Every signal gets followed, no matter how strange, because the alternative is a body found too late, because someone decided a sound didn't fit the pattern they expected. He radioed his supervisor, a woman named Teresa, who'd run search operations in that county for almost 20 years, and gave her the location and the timing. There was a pause on her end, longer than the situation seemed to call for. "You sure it's coming from inside the canyon?" she said. Not really a question. He told her yes, as sure as he could be given the acoustics. Another pause. Then she told him to hold position, that she was sending a second team to link up with him before anyone went in, and something in her voice made him not ask why the extra caution, not press for more detail than she was offering. He'd worked with Teresa long enough to trust when her instincts said to slow down. While he waited, alone at the canyon rim with his headlamp beam narrowing through fog that seemed to be thickening by the minute, the whistle came a third time. Same rhythm, same precision, except this time it sounded closer. He checked his radio. Still nothing from any other team in range. He checked his position against his map, confirming he hadn't drifted from the coordinates he'd reported, and stood there in the deepening cold with the canyon dropping away into darkness in front of him, listening to a distress signal that had no business sounding the way it did, repeating the way it did, in a place his team had already cleared and ruled empty that same morning. 20 minutes passed before the second team's headlamps appeared through the fog behind him. 20 minutes of standing alone at that canyon rim, listening. The whistle never quite repeating a fourth time, but somehow still present in every silence between. The way a sound can linger in your ears even after it's stopped. Teresa herself had come with the second team, which told him more than anything she'd said over the radio. She rarely came out to a search site in person anymore, not after 20 years of mostly running things from command. She stood at the canyon rim beside him, headlamp off, just listening, for almost a full minute before she said anything. "That canyon's done that before," she said finally, voice low enough that it barely carried past the two of them. "We don't grit it at night anymore. We wait for first light." He asked her what she meant. She didn't really answer, not directly, just told him that policy on this particular canyon had changed a few years back, before his time on the team, and that the change had come from experience rather than anything written up officially. She said it the way people say things they've decided not to explain further, and he'd worked with her long enough to know not to push. But the missing hiker was still out there, 30 hours and counting, and protocol didn't bend for institutional unease about a canyon's reputation. She made the call to send a small team in at first light rather than waiting through the full night, given the dropping temperatures and the very real possibility the man wouldn't survive another 12 hours exposed. Rob volunteered to go in with the two others, mostly because he'd been the one to hear the whistle, and felt like he owed it to whoever, or whatever, had made that sound to see it through. They went in a little before 6. Gray, pre-dawn light, barely enough to see by. Fog still pooled thick along the canyon floor in slow-moving sheets. The going was slow, careful. 3 headlamps sweeping the terrain in overlapping arcs as they worked their way down from the rim toward the canyon's dead end. A spot where the walls narrowed and a dry creek bed terminated against a sheer rock face. It was Rob who saw it first, hanging from a low branch at the canyon's dead end, exactly where the whistle had seemed to originate the night before. The missing hiker's whistle. The actual object still on its lanyard, hanging from a branch at roughly chest height, high enough that reaching it would have required either climbing or a height most people didn't have. He recognized it immediately from the incident report's equipment list. A bright orange plastic model, distinctive enough that there was no mistaking it for anyone else's gear. He photographed it before touching anything. Standard evidence protocol, then carefully removed it from the branch and bagged it. There was no sign of the hiker anywhere near it. No footprints leading to the branch. No disturbed ground beneath it. Nothing to suggest how the whistle had ended up hanging there rather than simply lying on the ground if it had been dropped or lost. The missing hiker was found later that same morning, alive, roughly 2 miles in the opposite direction from the canyon. Disoriented, hypothermic, badly dehydrated, but alive. When Rob's team finally got a chance to ask him about the whistle, expecting some explanation that would make sense of the whole strange night, what he told them only deepened the confusion. He said he'd lost the whistle on his first day out, dropped it somewhere near the trailhead, he thought, though he wasn't entirely sure. He remembered reaching for it early on and finding the lanyard around his neck empty, the whistle gone, and not thinking much of it at the time because he hadn't planned to need it. He'd never been near that canyon at all during his 30 hours lost. He'd gotten turned around early, well north of it, and stayed north the entire time, which meant the whistle that had been sounding from the canyon's dead end the night before, 3 precise blasts repeating on an unnaturally steady rhythm, had somehow traveled miles from wherever it had actually been dropped, ending up hung at chest height on a branch in a place its owner had never set foot. Nobody on the team had a theory that accounted for it cleanly. The official incident report noted the whistle as recovered evidence, its location documented, with no further explanation offered because none of the standard explanations fit. Weather couldn't move an object like that with any precision. An animal carrying it that distance and then hanging it deliberately from a branch made even less sense than the alternative nobody wanted to say out loud. Rob carries 2 whistles now, has for years since, though he's never fully explained to anyone why one wasn't enough anymore. He still works search and rescue in that county. He still knows that canyon better than almost anyone alive. He just doesn't grit it after dark, not anymore, not for any reason. The next account moves away from the search teams and the rescue radios, into a building instead, a trailside hostel where hikers pass through by the hundreds every season, and where one guest was given a room the owner didn't really want to rent. The hiker's name doesn't come up much in how this account gets told. Most people who repeat it just call him the guy with the back room, which tells you something about which detail stuck. He was 24, through hiking north, and had reached the hostel with a knee that needed a rest day and a resupply box waiting for him at the front desk. Nothing unusual about any of that. Hostels along the trail see hundreds of hikers like him every season, tired and grateful for a real bed, a hot shower, and one night without listening to rain on a tent fly. The hostel itself was an old converted farmhouse, a half-mile off the trail, run by a woman everyone just called Miss Ellen, who'd owned the place for going on 20 years, and knew most of the regular trail names better than she knew half the people in town. It had the usual setup: a bunk room that slept a dozen, a laundry line strung out back, a resupply shelf stocked with the things hikers always seemed to run out of, and a guest book by the front desk that every visitor was encouraged to sign. When he checked in that afternoon, Miss Ellen told him the main bunk room was full. A big group had come through together, taking every bed, and that she had a smaller room in the back he could use instead. She said it plainly enough, but something in how she said it made him pause for half a second before he agreed. "Just for tonight," she added, like she needed to clarify it wasn't a permanent arrangement, like the room itself needed that qualifier attached to it. He didn't think much of it at the time. A bed was a bed after 5 days on trail. The afternoon went the way 0 days usually go. He did his laundry, standing around in his rain jacket while his only other clothes tumbled dry, sorted 5 days' worth of resupply food into Ziploc bags at the kitchen table, walked into the small trail town for a burger that tasted like the best meal he'd had in a week. He showered for longer than strictly necessary, the water running hot and steady in a way his camp stove's boiled water never quite managed, and charged his phone from nearly dead to full for the first time in days. The back room turned out to be small but comfortable enough. A single bunk frame, a nightstand, a window looking out over the hostel's back field toward the tree line. He noticed other hikers' trail names carved into the wood frame of the bunk, the way names accumulate on furniture that's hosted enough strangers over enough years, and ran his thumb over a few of the deeper carvings before climbing in early, exhausted in the specific way that only a full day off trail after 5 days on it can produce. He fell asleep fast. The knocking woke him sometime around midnight. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the wall directly behind his bunk. He lay still for a moment, disoriented in that first half-second of waking in an unfamiliar room, and told himself it was probably another hiker in the room next door. Maybe leaning against the wall, maybe just the old farmhouse settling the way old buildings do once the temperature drops after dark. He almost went back to sleep on that explanation. Old buildings make noise. He'd stayed in enough of them by now to know that pipes and joists and settling foundations produced all kinds of sounds a person could talk themselves out of being concerned about. The knocking came again 10 minutes later, same 3 count, same even spacing between each knock, precise enough that it felt less like a structure settling and more like something deliberate. He sat up this time, listening hard in the dark, trying to place exactly where the sound was coming from. It seemed to originate from inside the wall itself rather than from an adjacent room. Not the muffled, secondhand quality of noise passing through a shared wall from someone else's space, but something closer, more immediate, like the knocking was happening within the wall's own thickness rather than against its far side. He checked his phone. Just past midnight. No one else seemed to be awake in the house. He couldn't hear any movement from the main bunk room down the hall. No voices. Nothing but the ordinary quiet of a house full of sleeping hikers. He lay back down eventually, telling himself the same thing people tell themselves in situations like this, that old buildings make noise, that whatever it was would probably stop, that he was tired enough to sleep through worse than 3 slow knocks against an old wall. And eventually it did stop, and eventually, exhausted enough that his body simply gave in regardless of what his mind wanted to keep listening for, he slept. He didn't think much about it the next morning. He mentioned it in passing to another hiker over coffee, framed it as a joke about creaky old farmhouses, and got a shrug in response. Nobody else in the main bunk room had heard anything unusual overnight. It wasn't until he happened to flip through the guest book sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting for his laundry to finish a second cycle, that something made him pause. Near the back of the book, where the entries jumped from one date to another with an unusually large gap between them, he found a note scrawled beside the date change. Backroom closed for repairs. 6 months. No explanation logged anywhere before or after it about what those repairs had actually been. He asked Miss Ellen about it later that afternoon, mostly out of idle curiosity, mentioning the gap in the guest book and the knocking from the night before in the same breath, expecting maybe a story about old plumbing or a wasp nest in the walls. She didn't answer right away. She was folding towels behind the front desk when he asked, and her hands went still for a moment before she picked the folding back up, not quite meeting his eyes. "That room doesn't usually get booked," she said finally. "I don't know why the system let it." That was all she offered. No further explanation, no story about repairs or plumbing or anything else that might have made the 6-month gap make sense. Just that one line, delivered quiet enough that he almost didn't catch the way her voice had changed while saying it. He had one more night booked at the hostel before rejoining the trail the next morning. The main bunk rooms group had moved on that day, freeing up beds, but somehow, when he went to check with Miss Ellen about switching rooms for his second night, she told him the system still had him down for the same room. She didn't offer to move him. He didn't ask twice, mostly because leaving the hostel entirely and spending the night in the woods instead felt, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, like the worse option. He told himself the knocking had probably just been the pipes. He told himself that all through dinner, all through the evening, right up until he climbed back into that same bunk for a second night and turned off the light. The knocking started again a little after midnight, same as the night before, 3 slow, even strikes against the wall behind his bunk, spaced with the same unnatural precision. He lay still in the dark, more awake this time than he'd been the first night, listening with the specific attention of someone who already suspects what they're about to hear. It repeated a second time, maybe 5 minutes later, same rhythm, same wall. He'd half expected it by then, which somehow made it worse rather than better, the anticipation sitting heavier in his chest than surprise would have. He thought about Miss Ellen's face when she told him the room didn't usually get booked, the way her hands had stilled over the towels, and he thought about the 6-month gap in the guest book with no explanation logged on either side of it. What he hadn't expected, what made him go fully rigid under the blanket in a way the wall knocking hadn't quite managed, was the 4th knock. It came from the window. He was on the 2nd floor. He knew that for certain. He'd looked out that same window the afternoon before, watched the backfield roll out toward the tree line from a height that put him well above ground level. No porch roof beneath the glass, no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. Nothing between that window and a straight 2-story drop to the grass below. 1 knock, then silence. He didn't move for a long time. He didn't look toward the window, didn't reach for his phone to check the time, didn't do anything except lie there with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and his breathing kept as quiet and even as he could manage. The way you go still when some old instinct tells you that stillness is safer than movement. The knocking didn't come again that night. He didn't sleep, not in any real sense. He drifted in and out of something closer to exhausted stillness than actual rest. And when the first gray light started coming through the curtains, he was still lying in the same position, still staring at the same spot on the ceiling. He packed his things quickly once the sun was fully up, moving through his morning routine on autopilot, and it was only when he was folding his sleeping bag that he made himself look toward the window properly, the way he hadn't been able to the night before. There was a faint mark on the outside of the glass. Condensation, though the night hadn't been particularly humid or cold enough to explain fog forming on a 2nd-story window, and within that thin film of moisture, pressed clear enough to make out, was the shape of a handprint. Fingers spread, palm flat against the pane. Positioned at roughly the height a person standing upright outside that window would have placed their hand, if there had been any surface at all for a person to stand on. He didn't touch it. He photographed it on his phone, hands not quite steady, and then he left the room without looking back at it again. He found Miss Ellen in the kitchen and told her about the 2nd knock, about the window, showed her the photo. She looked at it for a long moment, longer than the image itself seemed to warrant, and then handed his phone back without much comment beyond confirming, quietly, that yes, that window was on the 2nd floor, and no, there wasn't anything outside it that could account for a handprint appearing there. She didn't offer an explanation. She never really had, not for any of it, not the room's history, not the knocking, not the 6-month gap in the guest book. He got the sense, watching her carefully neutral expression, that she'd decided a long time ago it was better not to look too hard at things that didn't have good explanations, and that she'd rather he just finish his coffee and get back on trail. He did. He shouldered his pack, said his goodbyes, and hiked out that morning without once looking back at the hostel's 2nd-story windows. He finished his thru hike 4 months later. He's passed back through that same trail town more than once in the years since, and he still stays at that same hostel when his route brings him through. Miss Ellen still runs it, still remembers him by his trail name. He still books the main bunk room every time, without fail, and he's never once asked whether the back room gets rented to anyone else. A few years after his hike, he came across a hiking forum post from a stranger, describing almost the exact same experience: a back room at a trailside hostel, 3 slow knocks repeating over 2 nights, a knock at a second-floor window that shouldn't have been possible. No names mentioned, no hostel identified by location. Just the same details told by someone who had no way of knowing his story existed. He never replied to the post. He just closed the browser tab and didn't think about it again for a long while, though he still, even now, checks any hostel room he's given for which floor it's on before agreeing to stay the night. Another story, this one from a shuttle driver who spends more nights on the mountain roads around the trail than most hikers ever do, follows a similar pattern, the same feeling of something appearing twice where it shouldn't be able to. He'd been driving hikers between trailheads in the nearest town for going on 9 years, running the same loop of mountain roads so many times he could probably navigate most of it with his eyes closed. Late shuttle runs were nothing new to him. Hikers needed rides at all hours, especially the ones trying to beat a weather window or catch an early start the next morning, and he'd long since stopped thinking twice about driving those winding roads after dark. That particular evening, he had one passenger, a hiker heading back out to the trailhead after a night in town, already half asleep in the passenger seat by the time they cleared the edge of town and started climbing into the mountains proper. The radio played low, tuned to a country station that faded in and out depending on which side of the ridge they were on, and he had a coffee going cold in the cup holder that he kept meaning to finish and kept forgetting about. The road climbed in a long series of switchbacks, the kind that required real attention even after 9 years of driving them, headlights sweeping across gravel shoulders and dense tree line with each curve. He knew this stretch well. He knew where the blind corners were, where the shoulder narrowed to almost nothing, where a deer was most likely to bolt across without warning. Rounding one particular switchback, his headlights caught a figure standing at the road's shoulder. A man, barefoot, standing perfectly still at the edge of the gravel, facing the road. He registered it with mild surprise more than alarm at first. People did strange things in these mountains sometimes, and a barefoot man walking the roads at night, while unusual, wasn't entirely outside the range of things he'd seen over the years. Hunters lost their boots in creek crossings. People had all kinds of reasons for being out here that made sense to them, even if they didn't make sense to anyone else. He passed the curve, glanced back through his rearview mirror out of habit, and the figure was already gone from view, swallowed by the curve behind them. He didn't think much of it. Cold night for bare feet, he thought. But mountain folks were mountain folks, and it wasn't his business to slow down and ask questions of a stranger standing on a dark road at 11 at night. 2 curves later, the same figure was standing at the shoulder again. Same stance, same stillness, same position relative to the center line of the road, as if someone had picked the exact same spot on 2 entirely different curves nearly 2 miles apart and stood there in precisely the same posture, facing the same direction. He felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air coming through the vents. 2 miles was a long way to cover on foot in the time it had taken his truck to navigate 2 switchbacks, especially barefoot on cold gravel and asphalt. There was no trail cutting between those 2 points that he knew of. Nothing that would let a person move that distance that fast without a vehicle of their own. He reached over and turned the radio off without really deciding to do it, his hand acting faster than his conscious thought, and drove the next stretch in a silence that felt heavier than it should have. His passenger stirred slightly in his sleep, but didn't wake. He checked his rearview mirror more than he probably should have over the next mile, watching the empty road behind them curve away into darkness, half expecting and half dreading seeing that same figure appear again in the glass. The coffee in the cup holder had gone fully cold by the time he reached the third curve of that particular stretch, cold enough now that he'd stopped thinking about drinking it at all, his hands staying tight on the wheel instead. The fog was starting to settle into the low points between switchbacks, the way it often did once the temperature dropped enough after dark, thin gray sheets drifting low across the asphalt that his headlights cut through without fully dispersing. He told himself the obvious explanation as he drove, that it was the same person somehow, moving faster than seemed reasonable, taking some shortcut through the woods between the 2 points that he simply didn't know about, despite 9 years on this road. People who lived up here sometimes knew paths that didn't show up on any map, game trails and old logging cuts that could shave real distance off a route if you knew where they connected. It was a thin explanation. He knew it was thin even as he was building it in his own head, the way you sometimes construct an explanation, less because you believe it, and more because the alternative is worse to sit with. His passenger woke up somewhere around then, stretching in the seat, glancing over at him with the mild confusion of someone surfacing from sleep in an unfamiliar vehicle. "You all right?" the hiker asked, noticing something in how tightly he was gripping the wheel, maybe, or the fact that the radio had gone silent without explanation. He didn't answer right away. He was watching the road ahead, watching for the next curve, watching for whether the same figure would be waiting there a third time. He didn't answer the hiker's question directly, just muttered something about deer on the road, eyes still fixed ahead on the next curve approaching through the fog. The hiker settled back into his seat, seemingly satisfied with the explanation, though something in his posture had shifted too, a kind of alertness that hadn't been there before he'd fallen asleep an hour earlier. They took the curve slow, headlights sweeping the shoulder the way they had twice already, and this time the figure wasn't standing at the edge of the road. He was standing in the middle of the lane. The driver hit the brakes hard, tires losing traction for a sickening half-second on the damp asphalt before catching again, the truck swerving wide toward the opposite shoulder as he fought to keep it on the road. His passenger grabbed the door handle, breath catching audibly, both of them thrown forward against their seatbelts as the truck finally straightened out and came to a stop. Engine still running, headlights now aimed at nothing but the empty road and drifting fog. He looked in the rearview mirror immediately, expecting to see the figure standing somewhere behind them in the road, the way it had reappeared twice already. The road behind them was empty. Nothing there at all, not even fog thick enough to explain a figure simply being obscured from view. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The hiker was the one who finally broke the silence, voice quieter now than his earlier casual question had been. "Don't stop," he said. "My cousin told me about this road." The driver asked what he meant by that, what exactly his cousin had told him, but the hiker just shook his head slightly and didn't elaborate further, staring out the windshield at the empty stretch of road ahead like he'd already said more than he'd meant to. The driver didn't push. Something in the hiker's expression told him this wasn't a conversation either of them particularly wanted to finish having. Not right now. Not on this stretch of road with the truck still idling in the middle of the lane. He eased the truck forward again, slower now, watching every shadow along the tree line with a wariness that hadn't been there at the start of the drive. There was no shoulder wide enough to safely pull over even if he'd wanted to. No other traffic on the road this late to flag down if something went wrong, and he knew, without checking, that cell signal through this stretch of gap had been dead for the last 20 minutes at least. They reached the trailhead without further incident, the last few miles passing in a silence broken only by the truck's engine and the hiker's noticeably tighter breathing. He pulled into the small gravel lot, put the truck in park, and let out a breath he hadn't quite realized he'd been holding. The hiker gathered his gear from the back seat, and it was while he was bending down to retie his boots, routine, unremarkable, the kind of thing every hiker does before shouldering a pack, that he stopped and frowned down at his own feet. His bootlaces were loose. Not untied completely, but loosened at the top, the kind of half-undone knot that happens when someone starts pulling at laces and doesn't finish the job. He looked up at the driver with an expression that made something cold settle in the driver's stomach. "These were tight," the hiker said. "I tied them before we left town." Neither of them said much else. The hiker retied his boots properly, thanked the driver for the ride in a voice that had lost most of its earlier casualness, and headed off toward the trailhead with his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the dark ahead of him. The driver sat in the truck a moment longer before pulling out, and it was only as he was backing out of the parking space that his headlights swept across the passenger floor mat and caught something that made him put the truck back in park. A muddy footprint, bare, pressed clearly into the fabric of the mat. Not the hiker's. The shape and size didn't match his boots, didn't match his sock size either. When the driver thought back to the boots he'd just watched the man retie. The print was smaller through the arch, wider at the ball of the foot, the kind of shape a bare foot leaves when it's been walking on cold, uneven ground for a long time. He didn't examine it too closely. He got the truck moving and didn't stop again until he was back on the highway proper. Radio still off, coffee still cold and forgotten in the cup holder. He mentioned it to a couple of the other shuttle drivers over the following weeks, cautiously at first, expecting to be laughed at. He wasn't. Two of them admitted, somewhat reluctantly, to having seen something similar on that same stretch over the years. A figure on the shoulder, gone, and then somehow ahead again. Always on that particular series of curves through the gap. He still drives that route regularly. It's part of the job, and the job doesn't stop because of one strange night. But he keeps the radio on now for the entire drive, every time, without fail, and he makes a quiet point of never running that stretch of road with an empty passenger seat if there's any way to avoid it. The next account moves off the roads entirely, up onto open ground where there's nowhere left to hide from what's watching. A place thru-hikers have a name for, and a reputation they don't like to explain. They'd been planning the trip for months. A section hike along one of the trail's most scenic balds, timed deliberately to catch the golden hour views the ridge was known for. An anniversary trip for a couple who'd been married 11 years, and hiked together for most of them. Both experienced. Both comfortable with the terrain, the gear, the logistics of a night spent above the tree line. This wasn't a first trip into these mountains for either of them. The bald itself was one of those open grassy summits the Appalachians produce here and there. A wide sweep of rolling meadow where the forest simply stops and sky takes over. Views running unbroken for miles in every direction on a clear evening. It saw plenty of day hikers, people coming up for sunset photos and picnics, but overnight campers were rarer. The wind up there could be brutal, and most people preferred the shelter of tree cover for actually sleeping. They reached the bald with a few hours of daylight left, enough time to find a good flat spot and get the tent staked properly against whatever wind picked up after dark. It was while they were scouting for a campsite, walking the open grass with their packs still on, that the wife noticed something a little off about a patch of ground 30 yards from where they'd been planning to set up. A depression in the grass, roughly tent-shaped, flattened in a way that suggested something had camped there recently, not old enough to have fully sprung back upright, but not fresh either. Nothing especially strange about that on its own. Other hikers used this bald too, even if less often than the busier shelters along the main trail. They set up their own tent a comfortable distance from it, staking hard against the wind that was already picking up as the afternoon wore toward evening, and settled into the kind of easy routine that 11 years of hiking together produces. One of them boiling water for a freeze-dried dinner, while the other laid out sleeping pads, both of them working without needing to discuss who did what. They ate dinner sitting on a flat rock near the tent, watching the sun drop toward the ridgeline in a slow wash of orange and purple that neither of them had any words adequate for. The kind of view that made the whole trip worth the effort, regardless of anything else that happened. They laughed about how cold it was going to get once the sun fully dropped, joked about whether they'd packed enough layers, the ordinary, comfortable banter of two people who trusted each other completely in the woods. It was maybe an hour after full dark, both of them still sitting out watching the stars come out with a clarity the tree cover never allowed, when the wife noticed a light on the opposite ridge. It blinked at a steady, even interval, on, off, bright enough to be clearly visible across the distance separating the two ridgelines. Her husband noticed it too, and they debated it casually for a few minutes, the way you debate something that doesn't feel urgent yet. A headlamp, probably. Another camper somewhere on the opposite slope. Or possibly a fire tower, though neither of them could remember one being marked on the map for that particular ridge. They watched it a while longer, more out of idle curiosity than concern, and it was the husband who first noticed something that didn't quite sit right about how the light was behaving. It seemed to be moving steadily closer across the ridge, not the erratic bobbing of a headlamp attached to someone walking uneven terrain, climbing and descending with the natural rise and fall of the land, but something smoother than that. Steadier, moving in a straight, level line across a ridge that anyone on foot would have had to climb and descend repeatedly to traverse. Neither of them said much about it out loud. They zipped the tent a little earlier than they'd originally planned, settling into their sleeping bags with the kind of forced casualness people use when they've noticed something and decided, together and without discussing it directly, not to make it into a bigger deal than it needed to be. Probably just another camper, the wife said, mostly into the dark of the tent rather than to her husband specifically. Probably, he agreed, in a tone that suggested he believed it about as much as she did. They talked for a little while longer about nothing important, the ordinary low murmur of two people winding down toward sleep, and eventually the conversation trailed off into the particular silence of a shared tent at night, wind pressing steadily against the fly, cold seeping in at the edges, despite good sleeping bags. The vast open sky pressing down on the small nylon shelter in a way that felt different up here than it ever did under tree cover. The light on the opposite ridge was the last thing either of them consciously registered before sleep took them, still blinking at its steady interval, though neither of them was watching by the time it finally, at some point in the night, stopped. The wife woke first, sometime near 3 a.m, to a sound she couldn't immediately place. Something moving through the grass outside the tent, slow and deliberate, close enough that she could hear individual blades compressing under whatever weight was pressing down on them. She lay still, listening, and felt her husband shift beside her, awake now too, both of them frozen in that particular stillness people fall into when they're trying to hear something without giving away that they're listening. The sound moved in a slow arc around the tent's perimeter. Steady footsteps, evenly spaced, unhurried in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up more than a fast or panicked movement would have. Whatever was out there wasn't rushing. It was circling, patient, the way something moves when it isn't afraid of being heard. The tent fly rippled in a slow, rhythmic pattern that matched the footsteps almost exactly, pulsing inward gently with each step, and that was the detail that finally made her husband reach over and grip her hand hard in the dark. There was no wind. She could hear it, or rather, couldn't. The steady press of mountain wind that had been running against the tent fly all evening had gone completely still, and yet the fabric kept moving anyway, rippling in time with the footsteps circling outside, as if something were reaching out and brushing against the fabric with each slow pass. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved beyond the grip of hands in the dark. The footsteps continued their slow circuit. She tried counting, tried to track how many times it had gone around, and lost count somewhere after the fourth or fifth pass, unable to tell anymore whether it was the same loop repeating or something new each time. It went on for what felt like much longer than it probably was. Eventually, she couldn't have said exactly when, the footsteps simply stopped, and the wind returned to the fly at the same moment, as if whatever silence had been holding the air still had finally released it. Neither of them slept again that night. They lay there in the dark, hands still gripped together, waiting for the gray light of dawn to finally start showing at the seams of the tent. And when it did, neither of them said much of anything before unzipping the fly to look outside. The grass told a story neither of them wanted fully explained. A perfect circle surrounded their tent, grass pressed flat in an unbroken ring at a consistent distance from the fabric walls, evenly spaced the whole way around, like something had walked slow, deliberate laps at a fixed radius through the entire night. But there were no footprints in it. No individual impressions of feet, no shoe tread, nothing but the grass itself flattened smoothly in a continuous band, as if pressure had been applied evenly along the whole circle rather than by individual steps landing one after another. The second tent-shaped depression they'd noticed the evening before, the one 30 yards off, flattened by whatever previous camper had used that spot, was gone. Simply gone, the grass there standing upright and undisturbed, as though nothing had ever camped there at all. They packed up in near silence, moving faster than the morning's light really required, both of them casting glances back toward that ring of flattened grass more than either wanted to admit to the other. It was while they were breaking down the tent that another hiker, someone who'd camped further down the ridge and was passing through on his way to the trailhead, stopped briefly to chat. He was local, or close enough to it, grew up in a town at the base of the mountain, hiked this section regularly. When the wife mentioned, carefully, that they'd heard something circling their tent overnight, his expression shifted in a way that told her he wasn't surprised. "Folks around here don't really camp up on the bald alone," he said, half joking when they say it. Nobody really explains why. He didn't elaborate further, didn't offer any story or theory, just nodded toward the ring of pressed grass with something like recognition before continuing on his way down the trail. They found out later, from a different hiker who'd been camped a distance off with a trail camera set up for a time-lapse of the stars, that the camera had caught something in a single frame, time-stamped at 3:14 that morning. A blur crossing low and fast through the shot. Too indistinct to make out any real shape or size, gone again in the very next frame. They packed out that same morning, skipping the second night they'd originally planned. They still hike together every year, still 11 years and counting of trips into these mountains, but they've never camped above the tree line again. Not on that bald, not anywhere else exposed the same way. When people ask why, they usually just say the wind up there gets to be too much. Neither of them mentions the ring of flattened grass or the tent fly moving with no wind behind it, unless someone asks them very directly, and even then, they don't say much more than what's already been told here. The next account belongs to someone whose job it was to know these mountains better than almost anyone. A park ranger, working a quiet night shift, whose radio picked up something that had no business still being on the air. He'd been a ranger in that district for going on 12 years by the time it happened, and he'd tell you himself if you asked that very little about the job still surprised him. He knew the trails, knew the storm patterns, knew which sections of the park drew the most trouble every season and why. He wasn't the kind of man who scared at shadows. 12 years in these mountains had worn most of that reflex out of him a long time ago. The night in question was a quiet one, the kind that follows a bad storm. Heavy wind and rain had come through 2 days earlier, downing trees across several trail sections and forcing a handful of closures while crews assessed the damage. He was working the overnight shift alone at the station, mostly routine work, checking closure signage on the map, logging storm reports as they came in from crews out in the field. He'd made himself a pot of station coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been brewed the same way for 20 years, regardless of who was on duty, and settled in at the desk with the storm damage map spread out in front of him, marking off sections as reports trickled in over the working channel. Routine chatter, mostly, crew check-ins, a couple of minor incident reports, nothing that raised any flags. It was a little after 11 when the radio picked up something on a channel he didn't recognize using at first. The voice was faint, distorted with static, giving a location that took him a moment to place because it referenced a trail section using an old designation, one that hadn't been in official use for at least 3 years, since a landslide had forced a full reroute of that part of the trail. Nobody current would have used that old section name. It had been erased from the maps, from the signage, from every piece of documentation the department currently used. He frowned at the radio, assuming at first it was bleed over from a neighboring county's frequency, some quirk of atmospheric conditions carrying a signal further than it should reach. It happened occasionally, more often during storms, radio waves doing strange things when the pressure systems were unstable. He turned the volume up, trying to catch more of what was being said, but the transmission was too degraded to make out clearly. Fragments of a voice reciting coordinates and a call sign he didn't immediately place. Then it repeated. Same call sign, 3 times over, spaced evenly apart the way a distress call protocol would have you repeat it if you weren't getting a response. Something about that particular call sign nagged at him, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place, and it took him a good minute of sitting there with his coffee going cold before it clicked. He'd read that call sign once before, years earlier, buried in an old incident report he'd come across during his first year on the job. Back when he was still learning the department's history through old filing cabinets nobody had bothered digitizing. A ranger who'd gone missing on that same trail section, years before the reroute. The case had never been officially closed, not really, no body recovered, no clear explanation, just an unresolved file that eventually stopped being actively worked and got filed away with everything else the department preferred not to think too hard about. He sat there at the desk a long moment, the storm damage map still spread out in front of him, the radio gone quiet again after that third repetition of the call sign. He didn't respond. He wasn't entirely sure how he would have, or to whom, given that the frequency itself had been decommissioned and reassigned years earlier. Should have been carrying nothing but static, or, at most, some other department's unrelated chatter, not a voice using equipment and protocols that predated the reroute entirely. He told himself the obvious things. Equipment malfunction. Some old recording somehow looping through on a frequency that shouldn't have carried it. A prank, maybe, though he couldn't immediately think of who would have the knowledge or the equipment to pull off something that specific. None of the explanations sat right. He kept coming back to the call sign, to the way it had repeated with that same steady, deliberate rhythm he vaguely remembered other rangers describing about other strange things in these mountains over the years. Stories he'd mostly filed away as the kind of thing tired people said after too many overnight shifts, not anything he'd taken seriously. He logged the incident in his shift notes factually, without embellishment, because that was standard procedure regardless of how strange the transmission itself had been. Unidentified transmission received on decommissioned frequency, approximate time, content noted as best he could reconstruct it. He didn't mention the call sign's connection to the old missing ranger file. Not yet. He wasn't sure what to do with that piece of information, whether it meant anything at all or whether his tired mind was building connections that weren't really there. He sat at that desk for the rest of his shift with the radio volume still turned up higher than usual, listening for any repeat of the transmission, though it never came again that night. By the time his relief arrived at dawn, he still hadn't decided what, if anything, he was going to do about what he'd heard. He decided, somewhere in that gap between the transmission and the end of his shift, that he needed to see the old trail section for himself, just to be certain there was nothing and no one actually out there. He waited until his shift technically ended before making the drive, telling himself it wasn't really department business anymore at that point, just his own curiosity that needed settling before he could let the whole thing go. He remembered, as he pulled out of the station lot in the gray pre-dawn light, something a senior ranger had told him during his first year, half joking at the time, delivered in the kind of tone people use when they're not entirely joking at all. If dispatch ever picks up on the old channel, log it and don't go looking. That trail's closed for a reason nobody wrote down. He hadn't thought about that warning in years. It came back to him whole, word for word, as he drove the winding access road toward the old trailhead, the one that had been quietly removed from current park maps after the reroute. Its access gate left standing but rarely checked anymore since nothing officially routed hikers there. The gate was locked when he arrived, same as it had been the last time he'd had any reason to drive out this way, years earlier during the actual reroute work. He used his department key to open it, drove through, and locked it again behind him out of habit more than necessity. There wasn't anyone out here to keep out. Not on a trail section the department no longer patrolled or maintained. The old trailhead itself was overgrown, brush reclaiming what had once been a clear parking area, faded remnants of a trailhead sign barely legible where weather had worn the paint down to almost nothing. He parked, grabbed a flashlight though the light was strengthening by then, and started down the old trail on foot. It felt strange, walking a section of trail that technically didn't exist anymore, that had been erased from every current map and piece of signage, overgrown enough in places that he had to push through low branches that would have been cleared regularly if this were still an active section. The quiet out here felt different from the quiet on maintained trails. Deeper, somehow. The kind of silence that comes from a place people simply don't visit anymore. He followed the old trail for the better part of a mile before it started climbing toward what he remembered as the landslide site, the section that had failed catastrophically enough to force the reroute in the first place, a slope that had given way and taken a significant stretch of trail with it, exposed rock and root systems still visible even after several years of slow regrowth. He reached the dead end where the old trail simply stopped, cut off by the landslide scar, a jumble of exposed stone and disturbed earth that the mountain hadn't fully reclaimed yet. Sitting upright on a flat section of rock near the center of the slide, positioned almost deliberately, was a radio unit. Old. Decades old by the look of the casing, a model the department hadn't issued in years, long since replaced by newer equipment. Rusted in places, weathered by exposure, and yet, when he crouched down and examined it more closely, when he saw the small indicator light still glowing faintly on its housing, somehow still powered. Still transmitting, faintly, a thin static hiss carrying beneath it the same call sign he'd heard the night before, repeating on a loop too quiet to have carried any real distance. He stood there a long moment, flashlight beam trained on the old unit. Cold gate chain still gripped forgotten in one hand from locking up behind him earlier. There was no reasonable way a radio of that age, exposed to years of mountain weather, should still be holding any charge at all, let alone transmitting. He picked it up carefully, checked the serial number stamped into its housing, and something in his chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. He recognized the number. Or rather, he recognized the pattern of it, close enough to what he remembered from that old incident file he'd read years earlier. The missing ranger's case, the one that had never been officially closed, filed away and mostly forgotten by everyone except the small handful of people who'd worked in this district long enough to have stumbled across it in the archives. He didn't stay long after that. He carried the radio back down the overgrown trail, locked the gate behind him one final time, and drove back to the station in a silence that felt heavier than the empty road around him. He logged the radio as found equipment in his official report, factual and unembellished, the same way he'd logged the transmission itself. The department had no record explaining how a decades-old unit could still hold any charge, let alone transmit clearly enough to be picked up on a modern radio. Nobody offered a theory. Nobody really wanted to. He requested a transfer the following spring, citing reasons that had nothing to do with any of this on the paperwork. It was granted without much question. At his new station, in a different district entirely, nobody ever brought up that old trail's original name. Not once. Not in all the years he worked there afterward. He still keeps 2 radios in his truck, even now. He's never fully explained to anyone why one wasn't enough anymore. The next account moves off official trails entirely, onto private family land, where a father and his son learned that some warnings only make sense after you've already ignored them. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, a good stretch of hollow and ridge bordering the Appalachian Trail corridor, passed down through hands that had hunted it, farmed the flatter sections, and generally known every fold of it better than any map could show. He'd grown up on that land, learned to track deer sign in its mud before he learned to drive, and now he was teaching his own son the same things his father had taught him. His son was 14 that fall, old enough to hunt with him properly, old enough to sit still for hours without complaint, still young enough that everything about the land felt new to him in a way it had long since stopped feeling to his father. They'd set out that afternoon for a spot near the creek crossing at the eastern edge of the property, a place the family had hunted for as long as anyone could remember, close enough to the house that neither of them had thought twice about going out for what was meant to be a low-risk afternoon sit. They checked the trail camera mounted near the deer path on their way in, scrolling through the last few days of captures on the small screen. Nothing unusual, just the usual deer traffic and one blurry raccoon that had triggered the sensor at 3 in the morning. They set up near a good vantage point overlooking the creek, sharing a thermos of coffee between them, while his son practiced reading fresh sign in the mud along the bank, the way his father had taught him to identify a buck's track from a doe's by the shape and depth of the impression. It was a good afternoon, quiet and ordinary, right up until the light started shifting toward evening, and the creek, which had been running its usual steady noise over the rocks all afternoon, went completely silent. He noticed it before his son did, the way you notice an absence more readily than a presence sometimes. The water was still moving, still visible flowing over the same rocks it had been running over all afternoon, but the sound of it had dropped away almost entirely, reduced to something barely audible, even though nothing about the creek's actual flow appeared to have changed. The birds went quiet at almost the same moment. He'd hunted this land long enough to have a deep, almost unconscious awareness of the ambient sound of these woods. The constant background chatter of birds working the canopy, squirrels moving through leaf litter, the small, ceaseless noise of a forest going about its business. All of it stopped, all at once, in a way that felt less like a natural lull and more like something had reached out and simply switched it off. His son noticed it then too, going still beside him, glancing over with the kind of uncertain look a 14-year-old gives when he senses something's changed but doesn't yet have the experience to name what. That was when the voice called his son's name from across the creek. Faint. Distant enough that the words themselves were barely distinguishable, but close enough in cadence and pitch that something about it struck him as familiar in a way that raised the hair on his arms before his conscious mind had fully processed why. It sounded like his wife's voice. Except his wife was home, a good 3 miles away, with no reason and no way to be out here on this land calling their son's name from across a creek she rarely visited at all. His son started to stand, started to call back, the natural instinct of a boy hearing his mother's voice and wanting to answer it. His father's hand closed hard around his son's shoulder before he could get a word out, holding him still, holding him quiet. "That's not her," he said, low, more certain than he felt. His son looked at him, confused, clearly wanting an explanation his father didn't have ready to give. He told him it was probably an echo, or another hunter calling out to someone, the wind carrying sound strangely across the water the way it sometimes did in these hollows. He kept his voice steady while he said it, the way you keep your voice steady for your kid's sake even when your own certainty is starting to crack. The voice called again, closer this time, and this time it used a name that wasn't his son's given name at all, a nickname, the one only the family used, the one his wife had started calling their son when he was small, and that had stuck ever since. A private word that had no business being known to anyone standing across that creek. His grip on his son's shoulder tightened without him consciously deciding to tighten it. Neither of them moved. Neither of them called back. The birds stayed silent. The creek stayed unnaturally quiet. Water still moving over the rocks with almost no sound at all. And somewhere across that water, in the deepening shadow of the tree line, something that sounded almost exactly like his wife's voice was waiting for one of them to answer. It was standing there, hand still locked on his son's shoulder, that he remembered his own grandfather's rule about that creek. A piece of family knowledge passed down so many times over the years that it had worn smooth into something he'd stopped thinking of as a real warning and started treating as just another old story, the kind every family has about their land. Never answer a voice from the far bank once the birds go quiet. He'd heard it a dozen times growing up, always delivered the same way, usually as a half-joking aside whenever anyone mentioned hunting near that particular crossing. He remembered now, with a clarity that hadn't been there a moment earlier, that his grandfather had lost a hunting partner near this same stretch of creek decades ago. A story that had always been told vaguely, the details soft and unclear, the way old family stories often were. The man simply described as having gone missing on the property and never found, no further explanation ever attached to it that he could recall. He'd always assumed that was just an old accident, a man lost or hurt somewhere on difficult terrain. Nothing more mysterious than that. Standing here now, with his hand locked on his son's shoulder and that voice still calling from across the water, the story felt considerably less like an accident, and considerably more like a warning that had simply lost its explanation somewhere along the generations. The light was dropping fast now, dusk sliding toward full dark quicker than either of them wanted, and the truck was a good mile back through dense brush. A walk that would take real time in daylight and considerably more in the dark. Crossing the creek at their usual spot was the shortest route back, but their usual spot put them close to exactly where that voice had been calling from. He made the decision quickly, The kind of decision a father makes fast when a 14-year-old is standing beside him waiting to be told what to do. They'd cross at a different point, wider and further downstream, adding distance to their walk, but putting real space between them and whatever was calling from across the water. They moved quietly, his son sticking close beside him without needing to be told, both of them listening hard as they worked their way along the bank toward the wider crossing point. The voice didn't call again as they moved, though the silence around them stayed just as unnatural. The creek's sound still muted, the birds still absent from the darkening canopy. They reached the wider crossing and started across, careful in the low light, watching their footing on the wet rocks. It was on the far side, once they'd both made it across and were catching their breath on solid ground, that his son stopped and pointed down at the mud near the bank. Fresh boot prints facing them, positioned as though someone had been standing right there watching them cross. He crouched down to examine them, running a practiced eye over the tread and depth the way he'd taught his son to do earlier that same afternoon. No one else had permission to be on this property, and according to the trail camera's timestamp log, which he checked later that evening sitting at the kitchen table with his son beside him, no other person had triggered the sensor anywhere on the land that entire day. The camera near the deer path had recorded one more thing that evening, though. A single frame, time-stamped to the exact minute the voice had first called his son's name, showing nothing visible in frame at all. Just the creek, the tree line, the empty path. But the sensor log confirmed motion had been detected at that precise moment. Enough movement to trigger the camera's shutter, despite nothing appearing in the resulting image. They made it back to the truck without further incident. Driving home in a silence neither of them tried to fill with the radio or conversation, both of them processing the afternoon in whatever private way each of them needed to. They checked the crossing again the next morning, in full daylight, and it looked completely ordinary. Creek running loud and normal over the rocks, birds active in the canopy. Nothing about the place suggesting anything unusual had happened there the evening before. If he hadn't seen the boot prints himself, hadn't heard that voice with his own ears, he might have talked himself into believing the whole thing had been some trick of exhaustion or imagination. He still hunts that land. His family has hunted it for 3 generations, and he's not about to stop over something he still can't fully explain, even to himself. But he and his son have an understanding now, unspoken between them, formed in the space of that one evening, and never directly discussed since. They don't split up near that creek anymore. Not once the birds go quiet, not for any reason at all. The next account comes from a different kind of hiker altogether, someone who went looking for nothing more than a familiar afternoon loop, and found a trail that no longer agreed with the map he'd carried for years. He'd hiked that particular loop trail probably a dozen times over the years, a well-known local route that connected briefly with the Appalachian Trail, before circling back through a section of forest close enough to town that most people treated it as a casual day hike rather than a serious backcountry undertaking. He knew it well. Knew the junctions, knew roughly how long each section took, knew which overlooks were worth stopping at for photos. That particular Saturday had started like every other trip out there. A late morning start, good weather, a granola bar, and enough water for a few hours. His phone, fully charged with the GPS hiking app he always used loaded and ready before he'd even left cell service behind. He'd texted his wife an ETA before losing signal, the way he always did, expecting to be back at the trailhead well before dinner. The first 2 hours passed exactly the way he expected them to. He stopped at the usual overlook for photos, ate his granola bar standing at a familiar junction where the loop trail briefly touched the AT before continuing on its own route. Checked his GPS app periodically out of habit more than necessity, since he knew this trail well enough not to really need it. It was at that familiar junction, the one he'd passed through a dozen times before, that he noticed something that didn't match his memory of the place. A blue blaze, freshly painted, on a tree marking what appeared to be a side spur leading off from the junction. Blue blazes typically marked side trails branching off the main white-blazed AT. Nothing unusual about the color itself, just unusual because he didn't remember any spur trail existing at this particular junction, not in a dozen previous trips through here. He checked his GPS app. The spur didn't appear on his map at all. No trail line indicated branching off in that direction. He checked his paper map too, tucked in his pack more out of habit than because he expected to need it. Same result. No spur trail marked anywhere near this junction on either source. He stood there a moment, more curious than concerned, running through the obvious explanation. Trail maintenance crews sometimes cut new connector trails or rerouted sections without immediately updating every map and app that tracked the system. A lag between physical changes on the ground and digital documentation catching up. It happened. He'd seen it before on other trails, new blazes appearing well before any app update reflected them. Curiosity got the better of him. He had time, decent daylight left, and a properly marked blue blaze trail wasn't exactly venturing into the unknown, whatever gap existed in his map's data. He followed the spur. The trail tread felt slightly different underfoot almost immediately, less established, less worn by regular foot traffic than the main loop he was used to, though clearly maintained given the fresh blaze marking it. He followed it through denser forest than the main loop typically passed through, the canopy closing in tighter overhead, blocking more of the afternoon light than he remembered the main trail doing at this elevation. He checked his GPS app again after what felt like a solid 20 minutes of walking, expecting to see meaningful progress logged on the little blue dot representing his position. The dot had barely moved. According to the app, he'd covered perhaps a quarter mile, in the time he was certain had taken him closer to 2 hours based on how tired his legs felt, how much the light had shifted through the canopy above him, how hungry he'd become despite having eaten that granola bar, what felt like a reasonable while ago. He stopped walking and stood there a moment, genuinely confused now rather than simply curious. He checked his phone's battery level, wondering if some glitch was affecting the GPS tracking, and found it had dropped from a comfortable 70% down to just under 30%, a drain rate that made no sense for the amount of actual screen time he'd used that day. Something about the whole situation had stopped feeling like a simple maintenance update lag and started feeling like something he didn't have a good explanation for at all. He decided, standing there in the unfamiliar denser forest with his phone battery dropping faster than it should, and his GPS insisting he'd barely moved despite hours of walking, to turn back toward the original loop trail. The decision felt obvious once he made it, though some part of him was already uneasy about how long it might take to retrace a route that had apparently taken far longer to walk than distance alone could explain. He followed the blue blazes back the way he'd come, more unsettled than he wanted to admit to himself, watching the fading afternoon light with a growing awareness that he needed to be more careful about his remaining daylight than he'd planned for when he'd set out that morning expecting an easy, familiar loop. The walk back along the spur felt shorter than the walk out had, though he couldn't have said with any confidence whether that was actually true or just his own perception working against him at that point. He reached the junction eventually, back on the main loop trail he knew, and felt a measure of relief settle into his chest that surprised him with its intensity, given how ordinary the whole situation should have been. He kept moving, eager now to close out the loop and get back to his car before full dark, checking his GPS app periodically with a wariness that hadn't been there earlier in the day. The app seemed to be tracking normally again, distance accumulating at something closer to the pace he expected, which offered some reassurance even as the earlier discrepancy nagged at him. it was maybe 40 minutes further along the loop, on a stretch of trail he was certain he hadn't walked yet that day, that he came across a granola bar wrapper lying in the leaf litter just off the trail's edge. He almost walked past it without a second thought. Trail litter wasn't unusual, unfortunately, even on a well-maintained local loop. But something about the wrapper's specific branding caught his eye as he passed, and he stopped, crouched down, and picked it up. It was the same brand and flavor he'd eaten that morning at the junction. The same brand and flavor he was fairly certain he'd tucked the empty wrapper of into his own pack's trash pocket, rather than leaving on the trail, the way he always did, a habit ingrained deeply enough that littering felt almost physically wrong to him. He checked his pack's trash pocket. His own wrapper was there, exactly where he'd expected, folded and tucked away from that morning, which meant this was a different wrapper, or the same one, somehow, half a mile ahead of a section of trail he hadn't reached yet that day, on a stretch he was walking for the first time. He stood there a long moment in the fading light, the second wrapper crumpled in his hand, feeling something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. A vague memory surfaced then, something he'd read once on a hiking forum months earlier and dismissed without much thought. A comment buried in a longer thread about this same loop trail, mentioning a spur that wasn't really supposed to be there, warning that if you ever followed blue blazes you didn't recognize, you should turn around immediately rather than continuing. He hadn't turned around immediately. He'd followed it for a solid 20 minutes before doubt caught up with him. He picked up his pace after that, daylight fading faster now as the sun dropped toward the ridgeline, GPS app open and tracking, though he trusted it considerably less than he had that morning. He pushed through the last stretch of the loop with a kind of urgency he rarely felt on a familiar local trail, wanting nothing more than to see his car waiting in the trailhead parking lot. He reached what he believed was the trailhead lot, just as the last real daylight was fading into dusk. It was the wrong lot. He stood at the edge of a gravel parking area that looked almost identical to the one he'd started from that morning. Same general layout, same kind of trailhead signage, but subtly different in ways that took him a moment to fully register. The angle of the access road, the specific arrangement of the parking spaces, a trailhead kiosk positioned slightly differently than he remembered. His car wasn't there. A stranger's car was parked in almost exactly the spot his own vehicle had occupied that morning, coated in a thick layer of dust and pollen that suggested it had been sitting in that same spot for considerably longer than the few hours he'd been out hiking. He stood there in the gathering dark, genuinely unsure for a long moment what to do. Phone battery now critically low. No clear memory of how he could have ended up at what appeared to be a different trailhead lot entirely. One that, based on everything he understood about the loop trail's geography, should have required crossing an entire ridge he had no recollection of climbing. A local eventually found him there, an older man out walking his dog in the fading light, who recognized the confusion on his face immediately and offered, without needing much explanation, to drive him around to the correct lot one ridge over. They found his car there, exactly where he remembered leaving it that morning. "That loop does that," the older man said simply, as he was getting back into his own vehicle. "Most folks don't say much about it, sounds crazy otherwise." He didn't ask for more explanation than that. He thanked the man, got into his own car, and drove home in a silence he didn't try to fill with music or a podcast, the way he normally would have. He posted about the experience on a hiking forum a few days later, laying out the whole strange sequence of events in detail, half hoping someone would offer an explanation that made sense of it. He deleted the post less than a week afterward, uncomfortable with how it read once he'd had time to sit with it, uncomfortable with the handful of replies that had started accumulating from strangers describing eerily similar experiences on that same loop. Screenshots of the post still circulate occasionally, passed around by people who found it before he took it down. He's aware of that. He's never tried to get them removed, and he's never hiked that particular loop again. The last account in this collection is the one people in that county still don't much like discussing, pieced together from a missing hiker's recovered journal and a ranger's closing report, involving something that didn't just call a name from the trees, but seemed to know exactly what that name's owner was about to say next. His journal doesn't give a full name, just a trail name, the way most thru-hiker journals tend to record things. Details meant for himself, not for an audience, which is part of what made it circulate the way it eventually did once people started reading it. He was in his mid-20s, closing in on the final stretch of a months-long thru-hike, pushing extra miles most days to try to finish before a forecasted storm system rolled through and complicated the trail's final approach. He was tired in the specific bone-deep way that only accumulates over months of consecutive trail days, favoring a knee that had been bothering him since somewhere around mile 1100, rationing the last of his resupply with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this exact math dozens of times before, counting down mile markers with the particular focus of someone who could finally see the end of something enormous. He journaled every night by headlamp, a habit he'd kept up faithfully since day one, filling notebook after notebook with the small, unglamorous details of a long hike. What he ate, how his body felt. Occasional thoughts about people back home, about his sister in particular, who he mentioned more as the trail wore on, and the isolation gave him more time to think about the people he missed. 2 days before the entries that eventually drew attention, he'd passed through a shelter and signed the register the way he always did, quick and routine. It wasn't until he was well past that shelter, reviewing his own trail notes that evening, that he came across something that stopped him cold. An entry in that same register, 2 days back at a different shelter he'd also passed through, was signed with his trail name. The handwriting was close to his own. Close enough that at a glance it could have passed for his, but he had no memory of writing it. No memory of signing in at that particular shelter at all, though his itinerary confirmed he must have passed through it. He wrote about it in his journal that night, framing it mostly as exhaustion catching up with him, memory getting fuzzy after months on trail, or possibly another hiker playing some kind of joke using his trail name, which happened occasionally in a community small enough that names traveled quickly between people who'd never actually met. He didn't sleep well that night. He noted that in his journal too, almost as an aside, mentioning a restlessness he couldn't quite explain, a sense of being watched that he attributed, in the entry, to nerves about the approaching storm and the pressure of finishing on schedule. The next night was when it happened. He'd set up camp in a spot slightly off the main trail, a small clearing he'd used before on previous sections. Nothing unusual about the location itself. He was writing his journal entry by headlamp, same as every night, recording the day's miles and his knees' steadily worsening condition, when a voice began speaking from somewhere off-trail, beyond the reach of his headlamp's narrow beam. It was reading his journal entry from the night before, word for word, including a line about missing his sister, a private thought he'd written down but never spoken aloud to another living person on this entire hike, something that existed nowhere except in the pages of the notebook currently open on his lap. His journal entry from that night ends mid-sentence, not trailing off gradually, not toppling into an unfinished thought the way exhaustion sometimes produces. It stops cleanly, mid-word, the pencil mark cutting off abruptly in a way that suggested something had interrupted him at the exact moment he was writing, rather than him simply choosing to stop. The next entry in the notebook is dated 2 full days later, nothing in between. No account of what happened during those missing 48 hours, no explanation for the gap, just the abrupt cutoff of one entry and the start of another, as though no time had passed at all between them, except that the dates themselves made it clear something had. The entry that finally resumes, 2 days later according to the date at its top, is short. Shorter than anything else in the entire notebook, written in handwriting that's recognizably his, but noticeably less steady than his usual hand. The letters slightly uneven in a way exhaustion alone doesn't quite explain. It reads in its entirety, "I don't think I've been alone since the register." Nothing else follows it. No further entries appear anywhere in the notebook after that line, though there were dozens of blank pages remaining. More than enough for the final push to the trail's southern terminus that his itinerary suggests should have taken another 4 or 5 days to reach. According to the ranger's closing report, compiled after the fact once concerned family members reported him significantly overdue, he was found alive at the terminus itself, the official endpoint of his thru-hike, the place where hikers traditionally take a photo beside the trail's marking sign to commemorate finishing. He was physically fine. No injuries, no signs of exposure or malnutrition beyond what months of trail life had already worn into him. He'd simply arrived, on foot, days after he was expected, with no clear account of the time in between. When rangers and searchers asked him directly what had happened during those missing days, he couldn't or wouldn't say. The report notes his responses as consistently vague, describing an inability to account for roughly 48 hours of the hike's final stretch. No memory of the miles covered or the nights spent. Nothing that matched up with any coherent timeline investigators could piece together from what evidence existed. He never elaborated much further, not officially, not to the rangers who interviewed him, not really to his own family afterward either. There is one detail that surfaces in the account, mentioned only once, reluctantly, to someone close enough to him to have heard it directly, that in the time since finishing the hike, he's occasionally found his own handwriting in places he has no memory of writing it. A note, a few words. Never anything long, never anything he can point to as proof of anything specific. Just enough to make him distrust his own hand in a way he's never fully explained to anyone. A hostel owner near the trail's southern terminus, when asked about the story years later by someone who'd heard a version of it secondhand, offered only the same rule that seems to run through every account collected here, in one form or another, regardless of who tells it or where along the trail it happened. Don't answer if it already knows what you're going to say next. That was all she gave. No elaboration, no theory, nothing beyond that single sentence delivered the way people deliver things they've decided, long ago, not to examine too closely themselves. He finished his thru-hike, technically. His name is recorded in the completion logs the same as every other successful hiker that season. But he has never hiked again since. Not so much as a day trip, and his full pack, still loaded with gear from that final section, sits packed and untouched in a closet at his parents' house, exactly as it was when he handed it over the day he got home. He won't read his own journals from that hike. He's mentioned, on the rare occasions the subject comes up at all, that if the notebooks are ever shared with anyone else, the names in them should be changed first. The last physical page of that final notebook, water-stained and slightly warped from months of exposure to trail weather, carries one more line beneath the entry about not having been alone since the register. It's underlined twice, pressed hard enough into the paper that the pencil nearly tore through it in places. Hey, a woman on the Appalachian Trail once followed her own name being called uphill, off-trail, into fog, and found her own bootprint already waiting in the mud ahead of her. The exact words. The same sentence, word for word, that opened the very first account in this collection, written according to every date recorded in that notebook, more than a year before that woman ever set foot on the section of trail where it happened to her. Nobody has offered an explanation for that. Nobody in the small handful of people who know both stories well enough to notice the overlap has tried very hard to find one. The trail is still there, still crossing all the same ground it always has, still drawing thousands of hikers through those same hollows and ridgelines every single season. And somewhere along it, if these accounts are to be believed, something is still listening closely enough to know exactly which words come next.